We continue our fascinating immersion into the world of ancient Egypt, into an era when colossal pyramids were erected and pharaohs were considered living gods on earth. We have already spoken about the birth of civilization, the unification of the country, and the first dynasties. Today, we will talk about how the pharaohs proclaimed themselves perfect gods and sons of Ra, and how this was reflected in their relationships with their subjects and in the governance of the country. We will peek behind the scenes of courtly life, learn about the luxury of Queen Hetepheres, about dwarf jesters, and about the complex intrigues that tore apart the ruling house. We will trace how bureaucracy developed, how officials from common backgrounds could reach the pinnacles of power, and how this ultimately undermined the very foundations of the monarchy. We will touch upon the enigmatic pyramid texts, the most ancient religious incantations, and see how even in eternity, pharaohs strove to assert their superiority over the gods. And finally, we will witness the long and tragic reign of Pepi II, whose decline marked the end of an entire era, the inglorious end of the Old Kingdom. Prepare for a story of splendor and squalor, of divine right and human weaknesses, of grandiose constructions and profound social shifts that determined the fate of one of the greatest civilizations of antiquity. The apparent political and social stability of the Pyramid Age, especially during the reign of the powerful Fourth Dynasty, which left us such unsurpassed masterpieces as the Giza Pyramids, was in reality largely deceptive and did not reflect the full complexity of the internal situation. The brilliant and impenetrable screen of ostentatious state grandeur, monumental architecture, and the official ideology of divine kingship often concealed serious and profound disagreements that were subtly tearing apart the ruling royal house from within. Although the acute dynastic and possibly ideological crisis that apparently struck the Fourth Dynasty at the very height of its power was carefully veiled and found practically no reflection in the official written sources of that time, it nevertheless represented a very real and extremely serious threat to the very stability and continuity of power. Therefore, the rulers at the end of the Old Kingdom, especially the pharaohs of the Fifth and Sixth dynasties, were forced to make significant efforts to restore and strengthen their control over the complex process of throne succession and to neutralize potential rivals. This, in turn, gave rise to a new, somewhat different socio-political model of state administration, which, with certain modifications, existed for almost 3 more centuries after the clatter of thousands of hammers and chisels finally fell silent. On the gigantic construction sites of the Giza Plateau, the polygamy of Egyptian kings, who usually had one chief, great royal wife, and many secondary wives and concubines in their huge harem, was one of the main and constant reasons why numerous royal sons, born of different mothers and having accordingly, different statuses and rights to the throne, as well as their ambitious queen mothers, constantly vied and intrigued among themselves for power, influence at court, and ultimately for the right of succession to the throne. These inevitable and often fierce intradynastic disputes and conflicts, however, found practically no direct reflection in the official written sources of the Old Kingdom, such as royal annals or temple inscriptions. And this is quite understandable, as such unpleasant facts poorly corresponded to the idealized and propagandistic image of unshakable, divinely established, and harmonious royal power that the pharaohs themselves so diligently created and maintained, and to the notion of the unquestionable strength of their authority. We can only guess at the existence of these hidden conflicts and crises based on various indirect, fragmentary, and often very vague signs and testimonies, such as, for example, the inexplicably short and possibly violently interrupted reigns of some pharaohs in the middle of the Fourth Dynasty, for example, the enigmatic and almost nameless immediate heir of Khafre, King Bikaris, or Baka, or sudden and sharp changes in the official religious and construction policy of the royal court, such as, for example, the temporary transfer of the main royal cemetery from Giza to Abu Rawash under Jedefre, and then back to Giza under Khafre, or the final departure from Giza and the transfer of the royal necropolis to Saqqara and Abusir at the very end of this dynasty and under its successors. The reign of Pharaoh Shepseskaf, who was the son and immediate heir of Menkaure, the last of the great pyramid builders at Giza, was marked in history by only one, but very remarkable and indicative fact. He completely unexpectedly and decisively departed from the already established and, it would seem, unshakable fashion for building gigantic pyramidal tombs for kings. Instead, Shepseskaf built for himself a tomb of a completely different, archaic type, which in its form resembled a huge rectangular sarcophagus or a traditional mastaba of the early dynastic period, and which the Arabs later nicknamed mastabat, pharaon, meaning Pharaoh's bench. This sharp rejection of the pyramid, the main symbol of power and divinity of his predecessors, possibly testifies to a deep ideological crisis or a significant weakening of the state's economic resources by the end of the Fourth Dynasty. After the short reign of Shepseskaf and possibly one or two more ephemeral rulers, supreme power in Egypt passed to a new Fifth Dynasty, which ruled approximately from 2450 to 2325 BCE. The founder of this new dynasty was a pharaoh named Userkaf. The new king who came to power, possibly as a result of some court intrigues or even a coup, apparently saw himself as nothing less than a great reformer and restorer of ancient traditions. And he began his reforms with the choice of location and type for his own tomb, as a visible and symbolic reflection of his new ideological plans. Userkaf demonstratively rejected the bizarre and unconventional innovation of his immediate predecessor, Shepseskaf, and firmly returned to the traditional and canonical form of the royal tomb, the pyramid. It is very remarkable and symbolic that this new king, Userkaf, ordered his own, albeit relatively small, pyramid to be erected not in Giza or Dashur, but in the ancient necropolis of Saqqara, literally around the corner from the massive stone enclosure surrounding the famous step pyramid of the great king Djoser, which by this time was almost 2 centuries old. With this choice, Userkaf openly and unequivocally associated himself and his reign with one of the greatest and most revered rulers of the distant past, with Djoser, the founder of the Third Dynasty and builder of the first pyramid. He seemed to declare that his own reign was to open a new glorious page in the history of Egypt, just as Djoser himself had done in his time, initiating the era of the Old Kingdom. But if the gigantic and monolithic pyramids of Djoser, and especially of the Fourth Dynasty kings at Giza, by their overwhelming scale and perfection of form, were intended to personify above all the absolute, unshakable, and almost terrifying earthly power and eternal might of the pharaoh himself, then Userkaf, the founder of the Fifth Dynasty, seems to have wanted to bring to the fore a somewhat different aspect of royal ideology, its direct and inseparable connection with the divine world, and, above all, with the cult of the Supreme Sun, God Ra. His own pyramid at Saqqara was relatively low, only about 49 meters, or 161 feet in original height. Thus it became the lowest of all known royal pyramids of the Old Kingdom. A much larger share of state resources and attention under Userkaf and his successors was allocated to the construction of a completely new type of monumental cult structures not directly related to the traditional mortuary cult of the king himself. This new type of monument was the so-called Sun Temple, dedicated directly to the god Ra. Userkaf built the first and most famous of these sun temples not in Saqqara, but in a completely new location, Abusir, located on a desert plateau between Saqqara and Giza, near the ancient center of the solar cult Heliopolis. The construction of this first sun temple of Userkaf at Abusir was truly an epoch-making event in the religious and architectural history of ancient Egypt, and in its ideological significance, it perhaps was in no way inferior to the construction of Djoser's first step pyramid 2 centuries earlier. The temple received the characteristic name Nekhen Ra, which can be translated as Stronghold of Ra or Fortress of Ra. In the center of its large, open, and stone-paved courtyard was not a traditional obelisk, but a massive symbolic mound pedestal built of brick and cased with stone, which apparently symbolized the very primordial hill Benben, on which, according to Heliopolitan cosmology, the sun first rose at the creation of the world. This mound was surrounded on its perimeter by a high stone wall, separating the sacred space from the profane. The main cultic purpose of this new temple was to visibly emphasize and ritually ensure the existence of a special, direct, and unbreakable link between the reigning king and the sun god Ra himself, who was now increasingly seen as the father and patron of the pharaoh. Abundant sacrificial offerings to the god Ra were laid on a large, sun-exposed stone altar installed in front of this central mound pedestal. If we are to believe some later hieroglyphic depictions of similar sun temples, then on the top of this pedestal itself, initially perhaps, there was a tall wooden pole, or mast, on which the sun god Rahorakti himself was to symbolically sit in the guise of a sacred falcon, gazing upon his land and his son pharaoh, as befitted the main cult structure of the supreme state deity. This sun temple of Userkaf owned its own extensive landholdings and a large staff of priests and servants. And in its economic and ideological significance, it was apparently in no way inferior to the royal pyramid itself and its mortuary temple. Thus, for example, numerous donations and supplies intended to ensure the eternal mortuary cult of the pharaoh himself in his pyramid complex often first underwent a kind of sacred control and consecration precisely in the Sun Temple, where they received a special seal or mark certifying their divine quality and suitability for the king. These unique sun temples, which almost all Fifth Dynasty kings built for themselves at Abusir, were apparently not just an expression of their personal piety, but a kind of desperate ideological attempt to breathe new life into and give new meaning to a somewhat weakened and perhaps discredited by excessive ambitions monarchy. The gigantic and super expensive pyramids of the Fourth Dynasty, which required colossal expenditures of resources and labor, ultimately proved to be an unbearable burden for the country's economy and possibly caused some discontent in society. Therefore, the Fifth Dynasty pharaohs had to seek other, less costly, but no less effective ways to confirm their special status and the exceptional importance of royal power for the life of all Egyptian society. For this purpose, the image of the pharaoh himself was brought closer than ever before to the world of the gods, especially to the cult of the sun, god Ra, and at the same time, as it were, maximally distanced and elevated above the world of mere mortals, making him practically inaccessible and incomprehensible. If under the first three dynasties of the early dynastic period, the king was revered primarily as the earthly incarnation of the falcon god Horus, then already under the Fourth Dynasty, Pharaoh Jetephreh, as we recall, somewhat departed from this oldest dominant tradition, being the first to officially declare himself Son of Ra, and adding the name of the sun god itself to his royal titles. Relying on this important experience of his predecessors, Userkaf and his successors from the Fifth Dynasty further deepened and filled with specific cultic content their special filial relations with the sun god Ra. The memory of Userkaf in later popular tradition, reflected, for example, in the Westkar papyrus, was preserved as none other than the miraculously born son of the god Ra himself and the wife of the high priest of Heliopolis. Official state ideology now relied more and more not so much on the open and crude demonstration of the king's unlimited physical power and wealth as on a much more refined, complex, and abstract solar theology, widely using various psychological methods of influencing the consciousness of subjects instead of the previous direct right of force. This deliberate ideological and physical distancing of the deified king from his mere mortal subjects during the Fifth Dynasty also took other, quite concrete and visible forms. If the huge mastaba tombs of high officials and members of the royal family during the Fourth Dynasty usually adjoined the royal pyramids themselves at Giza or Dashur, and this physical proximity to the king's sacred monument itself reflected and emphasized the deceased's high status at court. Then, during the Fifth Dynasty, a much clearer and insurmountable boundary was drawn between the almost divine pharaoh and his even highest-ranking but still mere mortal subjects. Both in life and after death, commoners and even members of the royal family itself would now be much more carefully and demonstratively separated from the sacred person of the pharaoh. Less noble and influential individuals, not belonging to the very top of the administration, now had to be content with modest graves in the old cemeteries at Giza, which by this time had almost lost its significance as the main center of royal construction and was virtually abandoned by the new rulers. The highest dignitaries and priests of the Fifth Dynasty were still buried in the prestigious capital necropolis of Saqqara, but their tombs were now located separately from the royal ones. And the Fifth Dynasty pharaohs themselves, starting with Sahure, demonstratively shunned these old and overcrowded necropolises and built their own, much more modest in size, but still impressive pyramid complexes and sun temples in a completely new location, Abusir, situated between Giza and Saqqara. The former almost familial closeness of high officials to the royal house and their dominant role in state administration, characteristic of the Fourth Dynasty, also gradually faded into the past. From the most ancient times until the very end of the Fourth Dynasty's reign, virtually all key and highest posts in Egypt's complex governmental apparatus were occupied exclusively by close royal relatives: sons, brothers, uncles, nephews, and sons-in-law of the pharaoh himself. From Sneferu to Menkaure, all known viziers, or chatis, without a single exception, as well as most overseers of all royal works, were princes of the blood. However, Userkaf, the founder of the new Fifth Dynasty, unexpectedly and decisively broke with this centuries-old tradition of nepotism, and for the first time widely opened access to high state administration for people of non-royal origin, for talented and loyal officials who had made careers thanks to their personal qualities. This innovation had very important and far-reaching consequences for all subsequent Egyptian history. In all likelihood, such a cardinal change in personnel policy was dictated to Userkaf by both ideological and purely practical considerations. On the one hand, it allowed the king himself and his immediate family to symbolically rise even higher above the rest of the bureaucratic apparatus of government, emphasizing their exceptional divine status. And on the other hand, which was perhaps no less important from a practical point of view, by depriving potentially dangerous and prone to rebellion numerous princes of the blood of direct access to the real levers of power and enormous state resources, Userkaf probably hoped in this way to put an end to the frequent internal strife, conspiracies, and struggles for the throne that had repeatedly threatened the stability of the monarchy itself under his predecessors. As a result of these reforms, a new, much more numerous and professional class of career officialdom gradually formed and significantly strengthened during the Fifth Dynasty, consisting mainly of people who had achieved high position and power thanks to their personal abilities, education, diligence, and, of course, loyalty to the pharaoh, and not just thanks to their family ties with the royal house. Furthermore, this significant expansion and complication of the entire bureaucratic apparatus necessary for managing the ever-growing state inevitably testifies to an increasing specialization and clear demarcation of previously often combined functions between different departments and officials. Whereas before, the same royal relative could simultaneously hold many of the most diverse and often unrelated honorary positions solely due to his high birth. Now a professional official, actually and daily engaged in complex matters of state. Administration clearly could no longer successfully and effectively cope with a dozen different functions simultaneously. It was these new professional administrators, and not just royal relatives, who would henceforth constitute the main backbone and support of the entire complex governmental machine of ancient Egypt. And the daily work of such a professional, specialized, and responsible official, not necessarily of noble origin, but devoted to his work, apparently proved to be much more effective and useful for the state than the activities of previous noble dilettantes. The creation of this new, ramified, and professional civil service, now predominantly staffed by commoners, that is, from the middle strata of the population not directly connected to the royal family, as well as the emergence and rapid growth of new, prestigious necropolises for high dignitaries such as Abusir and especially Saqqara, where their own, often very large and richly decorated mastaba tombs were now built, no longer dominated by the overwhelming mass of a gigantic royal pyramid. These, two important and interconnected socio-political phenomena of the late Old Kingdom, especially during the 5th and 6th dynasties, formed the new historical backdrop against which the most remarkable and informative written and artistic monuments of that time appeared, the famous tombs of court nobles and high officials. For the first time in all preceding ancient Egyptian history, these private tombs, with their detailed reliefs, paintings, and autobiographical inscriptions, allow us, as it were, to peek behind the official facade of royal ideology and enter the world of daily life, concerns, ambitions, and beliefs of the pharaoh's own subjects. A world where much that is surprising and unexpected awaits us. First and foremost, when studying these private tombs, one must note the highest artistic merits of their interior decoration, especially concerning the burials of high dignitaries from the time of the 5th and particularly the 6th dynasties, who ruled approximately from 2450 to 2175 BCE. The amazing subtlety, realism, and vitality of the magnificent colored reliefs and paintings completely covering the walls of their funerary chapels serve as irrefutable proof of the highest level of skill of ancient Egyptian artists and sculptors. Of that era, a skill honed and brought to perfection in the construction and decoration of grandiose royal pyramid complexes and sun temples at Dahshur, Giza, and Abusir. Now having, thanks to their high position and the pharaoh's generosity, the opportunity to erect for themselves extensive and durable stone or brick funerary structures, and, of course, wishing to make an indelible impression on their no less vain contemporaries and descendants from their own class, the noble magnates of the late Old Kingdom paid increasing attention to both architectural planning and especially to the rich and diverse artistic decoration of their eternal tombs. Soon, this unspoken competition in luxury and tomb size turned into a kind of prestigious arms race among the high nobility. And before embarking on the costly and lengthy construction of his mastaba, an ambitious official often patiently waited for his next and decisive promotion, which would give him the necessary means and the right to a more lavish burial, so that then, by means of the magnificent architecture and rich decoration of his tomb, he could, as it were, posthumously rise above both his contemporary rivals and their numerous descendants, who were to forever remember his fame and power. Particular paramount attention was paid by noble Egyptian magnates in the construction of their tombs to the so-called memorial chapels. These usually consisted of either a single spacious common hall or a whole group of small but richly decorated above-ground rooms where members of the deceased's family, his mortuary priests, and other visitors could freely enter for the regular performance of ritual offerings and libations before the statue or false door of the deceased, as well as for holding memorial feasts. The burial chambers themselves, where the sarcophagus with the mummy was directly located, were usually hidden from public view deep underground at the end of a long vertical shaft or sloping corridor, and therefore they were generally decorated, much more modestly and schematically, if at all. Do not hide from people what you can rightfully show off and be proud of. Such, apparently, was the unspoken life and funerary principle of ancient Egyptian aristocrats. In the very themes and composition of the paintings and reliefs adorning the walls of these tombs, there was a fairly stable and strictly observed system of canons, determined by religious beliefs and social norms. Although the carefully thought-out and rich artistic decoration of the mastaba undoubtedly was intended primarily to emphasize the high social status and personal superiority of its owner in the cruel and competitive bureaucratic world in which he lived and made his career, One should always remember that, first and foremost, a tomb is not just a monument to vanity, but a sacred and eternal resting place for the immortal Ka and Ba souls of the deceased. Therefore, the most important and obligatory themes of tomb decoration were inextricably linked with ensuring the magical production and eternal offering of the most diverse sacrifices and gifts for the deceased, starting from items of first necessity for his afterlife, such as abundant bread and beer, meat, poultry, vegetables, and fruits, and ending with all sorts of attributes of luxury and comfort, such as expensive furniture, exquisite incense and oils, precious jewelry, fine linen, clothes, and fortified wine. Numerous and very detailed scenes dedicated to these themes of eternal supply abound with invaluable information for us about various techniques of ancient Egyptian agriculture, cattle breeding, craft production, methods of preparing food and drinks, and about the daily life and labor of common people. But it should be remembered that the accurate and realistic reproduction of all these details of daily life was by no means the main goal of ancient Egyptian artists. These paintings and reliefs rather acted as a kind of magical insurance in case real offerings from descendants ceased. For, according to the deep beliefs of the ancient Egyptians, in case of damage or loss of the real funerary inventory or the cessation of real offerings, these very images on the tomb walls were supposed to magically come to life, incarnated into reality thanks to the supernatural power of magical spells, and thus become an eternal and inexhaustible source of everything necessary for the comfortable existence of the deceased soul in the afterlife. In the same miraculous way, the numerous images of servants and gift-bearers who, as it were, descend in an endless procession along the tomb walls towards the so-called false door leading to the burial chamber, were supposed to come to life eternally, and then they would eternally serve their deceased master and bring him all necessary food and drink. Thus, taking into account this dual utilitarian magical and at the same time prestigious social purpose of the mortuary temple or chapel in a nobleman's tomb, on the one hand, to emphasize his high earthly status and merits, and on the other, to ensure him an eternal and comfortable posthumous existence. It becomes quite understandable why the wall paintings and reliefs in these tombs always depict not so much the harsh and often unattractive reality of life in ancient Egypt as a certain idealized, harmonious, and eternally prosperous picture of this life, as it should have been in the perception of the tomb owner himself and his contemporaries. Talented sculptors and artists who worked on the decoration of these tombs depicted only what their high-ranking client wanted and paid for. Therefore, wall paintings and reliefs were primarily intended to serve as an apology, that is, a justification and glorification of the existing social order and the place that the deceased himself occupied in it. Thus, for example, the tomb owner, the deceased nobleman, was often depicted in reliefs as much taller and larger in size than all other figures, as if he physically dominated the dwarf-like figures of his servants, workers, and even members of his own family who barely reached his knees. In this, perhaps not always understandable to modern man, artistic principle of so-called hierarchical scale, where the size of a figure directly depends on its social status and not on real proportions, the deep adherence of ancient Egyptians to strict hierarchy, to respect for rank, and to the immutability of established ranks is perfectly and vividly reflected. Another very characteristic feature of all ancient Egyptian tomb paintings and reliefs was their emphasized timelessness, static nature, and idealization. Dynamism, movement, and chance were either very weakly expressed in them or absent altogether. Human figures, especially those of noble persons, seemed frozen forever in time and space in certain ideal canonical poses. Also characteristic is the almost complete absence in these depictions of such key and strictly individual events in the real life of the buried person as his childhood, youth, marriage, birth of children, or even his specific steps in career advancement. The inclusion of these transient and strictly personal scenes in the overall composition of the tomb decoration was apparently not considered important and would have meant preserving for centuries something accidental and insignificant. Whereas the main goal was to capture and preserve for eternity only the most important, final, and status-defining moments of his life, such as the peak of his career, his enormous wealth, his high social position, and his ideal family relations. Despite the fact that these tomb paintings and reliefs, due to their specificity and conventionality, cannot serve as an absolutely reliable and objective source of information about the real daily life of all strata of ancient Egyptian society, they, nevertheless, allow us to understand much better the customs, interests, values, and worldview of the ancient Egyptian ruling elite itself for whom they were created. They recreate with amazing meticulousness and love for detail all those numerous pleasures and entertainments of a rich and idle life that noble magnates enjoyed in life and hope to continue in the afterlife. This includes exciting hunting of wild animals in the desert with dogs and bows, calm fishing from a boat in Nile backwaters, and fascinating trapping of wild birds in dense papyrus thickets with throwing sticks or nets, as well as various quiet domestic activities and entertainments. In one such typical scene in the tomb of the famous vizier Mereruka, who lived at the beginning of the 6th dynasty, Mereruka himself is depicted resting in his house, where he is simultaneously drawing something on a tablet and playing the popular board game Senet with his wife. In the next scene, numerous male and female servants are already preparing him for bed. They carefully make his high bed, set up a comfortable wooden headrest, and draw a light canopy for protection from insects. Then Mereruka himself is all ready, reclining on his luxurious bed, and his beloved wife sits beside him and delights his ear by playing an elegant harp. Sometimes, however, the almighty dignitary still had to distract himself from these pleasant amusements and attend to urgent state affairs, such as inspecting his estates or collecting taxes. But even in such an official case, he usually moved around the country in none other than a comfortable covered palanquin, carried on the shoulders of sturdy servants, protecting him from the scorching sun and road dust. Naturally, such an idle, luxurious, and carefree lifestyle of the high Egyptian nobility, as depicted on the walls of their tombs, had almost nothing in common with the hard, exhausting, and often semi-starved daily reality of the main mass of the rural population of ancient Egypt, both in those ancient times and, in many ways, in much later, almost modern eras. Although many high-ranking officials at that time, as we know, often came from relatively non-noble middle strata of society, as soon as they set foot on this thorny but promising career path of state service, they immediately sought to distance themselves as much as possible from the common people from whom they themselves had recently emerged, and to wallow as soon as possible in all the delights of luxury and idleness available to them. Or at least they comforted themselves with sweet thoughts of such a serene and secure existence in the afterlife, which they so meticulously ordered to be depicted in their tombs. If pictures of the real external world, the world of hard peasant labor and need, sometimes did penetrate through the silk curtains of their palanquins or onto the walls of their tombs, it was only to further emphasize this striking social contrast and their own privileged position. The idealized idle life of the almighty vizier, so lovingly and detailedly captured on the walls of his tomb, sharply contrasts with other, much rarer, but no less indicative scenes depicting the harsh daily life of simple Egyptian peasants, and especially with those scenes of punishment that inevitably awaited those of them who failed to pay the state-established taxes on time and in full. Unenviable, for example, was the fate of a village elder whose villagers were caught in tax arrears. Such a guilty elder was mercilessly dragged by royal officials and their assistants to the local tax office, where he was publicly stripped naked, firmly tied to a pillory, and cruelly flogged with rods or sticks on his back and heels, while imperturbable scribes carefully and dispassionately recorded the crime itself and the punishment assigned on papyrus. The life of the common people beyond the high walls of luxurious palaces and rich noble estates was undoubtedly full of hard labor, sorrow, diseases, and numerous deprivations. This striking social contrast between the life of the elite and the common people is best demonstrated by the situation in healthcare and life expectancy in ancient Egypt at that time. Representatives of the higher privileged class always had access to the best doctors, available medicines, and relatively good hygienic conditions. Therefore, it is no coincidence that in tomb paintings and reliefs, noble magnates and members of their families are always depicted as perfectly healthy, strong, beautiful, and full of vitality, and their women as slender, young, and always shining with unearthly beauty. A completely different, much grimmer picture is observed in the paleopathological study of numerous bone and mummified remains of common Egyptians from the same period, as well as in the careful study of some rare but very realistic scenes from the Iui, daily life of commoners sometimes found in the tomb paintings of nobles. All these data irrefutably confirm that severe infectious and parasitic diseases, many of which, unfortunately, are still found in rural areas of Egypt today, were practically constant and inevitable companions of most simple Egyptian peasants throughout their short lives. Among such most common and debilitating diseases was, for example, schistosomiasis, a severe parasitic disease caused by small schistosome worms, the larvae of which are carried by numerous freshwater snails abundantly inhabiting the warm, stagnant or slow-flowing waters of irrigation canals and flooded fields where peasants constantly worked. In schistosomiasis, the patient often has blood in the urine, develops chronic anemia, weakness, exhaustion, and a general decline in vitality. Judging by the prevalence of this disease, identified during the study of mummies, it was apparently one of the main causes of high infant mortality and low average life expectancy in ancient Egypt. Tuberculosis was also widespread, often affecting not only the lungs, but also the bones, especially the spine, causing its severe deformation, known as Pott's disease, or tuberculous spondylitis, leading to the appearance of a hump. Exhausting and monotonous physical labor from early childhood, associated with carrying heavy loads and constant bending, also contributed to the rapid wear and destruction of the spine and joints in most peasants. In addition, the skeletons of commoners from the Old Kingdom often bear traces of other severe diseases, such as arthritis, osteomyelitis, and sometimes even malignant tumors. In 3 rare but very realistic scenes from tombs, one can notice figures of common people with clear signs of inguinal hernia, probably also related to heavy physical labor. Perhaps these few realistic details were reproduced by artists only to give the scenes a certain special rustic flavor. In general, all these diseases, deformities, dirt, and sufferings of the common people, of course, had no place in the refined and idealized aristocratic notions of the ruling Egyptian elite about an eternal and beautiful afterlife. How far the ruling class of ancient Egypt actually was from the daily needs, concerns, and interests of the main mass of the country's population becomes especially clear if we take a closer look at what many of the owners of these luxurious Saqqara tombs actually did in life and what positions they held. Undoubtedly, some of them, such as the already mentioned Mereruka or his predecessor as vizier, Kagemni, were indeed top statesmen, viziers, and held the most important posts in the administration, involving enormous responsibility and real governance of the country. However, many other high-ranking dignitaries, judging by their titles, achieved dizzying success in their careers and incredible wealth solely thanks to their personal closeness to the pharaoh and their ability to cater to his whims, although the real extent of their state responsibility and benefit to the country was perhaps very negligible. For example, a certain Userkaf, who was honored with a large and beautiful tomb in Saqqara, was merely the chief of the palace butchers, and his main role in the state, apparently, was to ensure an uninterrupted supply of choice meat to the royals' court. Judging by the luxurious decoration of his tomb, the pharaoh, it seems, was much more concerned about the menu of his daily dinner than the real professionalism of his top ministers. Similarly, the twin brothers Niankhnum and Khnumhotep, who, surprisingly enough, jointly held the very intimate and honorable post of chief palace manicurists under one of the 5th dynasty pharaohs, were honored for their loyal service to the royal fingernails with a huge and extremely richly decorated joint tomb, one of the most famous in Saqqara. And another powerful vizier named Kentika, it seems, owed his incredible career advancement not so much to his outstanding state talents or impeccable service for the good of the country as to the skillful and diligent service to the sacred person of the king in his daily life. Among his numerous and lavish titles, we find such as Overseer of the Royal Robing Room, Supervisor of all the Pharaoh's garments, Keeper of the King's sacred kilts, Master of all the secrets of His Majesty's washing room, and even Senior of His Majesty's dining chamber. In other words, it seems that at the somewhat effete and increasingly alienated from the people royal court of the 5th dynasty, the highest honors, privileges, and luxurious tombs in the prestigious Saqqara necropolis were awarded not so much to talented treasurers, wise judges, or experienced chiefs of all royal works, as to such characters as chief of all palace hairdressers. The inner courtyard of the magnificent and huge tomb of another influential 5th dynasty nobleman named T was surrounded by entire rows of elegant columns with lotiform capitals. A long corridor, decorated with reliefs, led from there to 2 large halls, and then to a separate secret serdab chamber, where a magnificent life-size statue of the nobleman himself stood in eternal gloom. Tai's huge and luxurious mastaba is another vivid testimony that the pharaoh's personal favor and benevolence still remain the main and almost only pass into the closed world of enormous wealth, power, and posthumous fame for the Egyptian nobility. The road to the highest echelons of the governmental apparatus may have been formally open to capable commoners now, but old courtly habits and favoritism, it seems, died very hard. A striking example of the amazing tenacity of this old system of promotion based on personal connections and kinship can be seen in the impressive career and biography of a certain Ptahshepses, who lived around 2400 BCE under Pharaoh Niuserre. Ptahshepses owns the largest and one of the most luxurious private mastabas of the entire 5th dynasty period, discovered at Abusir. The turning and decisive moment in his entire life and career was, apparently, his second marriage to the ruling pharaoh's own daughter. Having become the pharaoh's son-in-law, Ptahshepses immediately gained access to the innermost circle of his trusted confidants and advisors, as well as numerous honorary positions and titles. This new, exceptionally high status of a royal dignitary immediately played an important role in the expansion and rebuilding of his already under construction tomb. In particular, an additional, even more lavish and monumental columned entrance, befitting his new position, was hastily added to it. But this dizzying and, it would seem, so successful career success, achieved through marriage, had, as often happens, its dark side. To ensure the future of his new children, born of a royal daughter and thus having royal blood, Ptahshepses, as some details of his autobiographical inscription hint, seems to have been forced to virtually disinherit and remove from main honors his eldest son, born to him in his first, less noble marriage. It seems that in the conditions of the absolute monarchy of ancient Egypt, undivided loyalty and devotion to the ruling king and his family were above all else, even the most sacred family ties and paternal interests. The important reforms carried out at the very beginning of the 5th dynasty's reign, one of the main goals of which, as we recall, was to significantly distance numerous members of the royal family itself from direct participation in state administration and to limit their political influence, paradoxically gave rise to another, no less serious problem: the rapid and uncontrolled growth of a greatly expanded, all-pervading, and extremely voracious bureaucratic apparatus. By the middle of the 5th dynasty's reign, the total number of various state positions and their accompanying lavish and often meaningless honorary titles had reached such an incredible number that a kind of official hierarchical table of ranks was even developed. It was intended to somehow help the officials themselves and their contemporaries understand the confusing relationships between various positions in terms of their seniority and prestige. But this ever-growing and strengthening class of high dignitaries, not directly related to the royal family, but possessing enormous real power and control over the country's resources, eventually began to pose an increasing threat to the absolute power of the king himself, who could not indifferently and calmly observe this dangerous process. Therefore, by the very end of the Fifth Dynasty, around 2350 BCE, the pharaohs, realizing this threat, made a new attempt to reorganize and streamline their bloated administration, seeking to somewhat reduce the total number of officials and, more importantly, to significantly limit their excessive influence and independence. The main content of these new counter-reforms was, apparently, the transfer of some former functions and powers from the center to the localities, that is, strengthening the power of local rulers' nomarchs, who were to become a counterweight to the capital's bureaucracy. However, by thus seeking to limit the exorbitant influence of their ambitious capital courtiers and ministers, the central royal authority, without fully intending or realizing it, actually prepared the ground for its own future, weakening and decline. This had very serious and extremely negative long-term consequences for the political stability of the entire Egyptian state. For local nobles, nomarchs, once they had tasted real power and independence, were no longer going to simply give it up and submit to the center. And this new, strengthened provincial bureaucracy and nobility, formed at the very end of the Old Kingdom, ultimately played a very significant, if not decisive, role in its subsequent weakening and final fall during the First Intermediate Period. While the numerous nobility and high officialdom of ancient Egypt diligently erected increasingly lavish and richly decorated tombs for themselves in the capital necropolises, the Fifth Dynasty pharaohs themselves, who ruled approximately from 2450 to 2325 BCE, unlike their Fourth Dynasty predecessors, focused their main construction efforts not so much on erecting gigantic pyramids for themselves, but on building a completely new type of cult structures, so-called sun temples, dedicated to their main divine patron, the sun god Ra from Heliopolis. The very names of most of the 5 immediate successors of the dynasty's founder, Userkaf, contained the sacred name of the god Ra as the main and principal component of their throne name. These were kings Sahure, Mereruka, Shepseskaf, Neferefre, and Nuser. They all, with the exception of Shepseskaf, erected their own, now much more modest in size and construction quality, royal pyramids in a new, specially chosen location. Abusir, situated somewhat north of Saqqara and, characteristically, in close proximity to that very first sun temple built by Userkaf. The Fifth Dynasty royal pyramids themselves were, as a rule, no longer as massive and durable as their predecessors at Giza. Their core was often made of cheaper and less durable material, local limestone or even mud brick. But their mortuary temples were beautifully and very richly decorated with reliefs and paintings in full accordance with the new fashion and artistic canons of that time. In King Sahure's pyramid complex alone, for example, the total area of skillfully carved and brightly painted reliefs covering the walls of his valley and mortuary temples, as well as the covered causeway connecting them, was estimated to be about 12,000 square yards, that is, more than 10,000 square meters. New motifs, characteristic specifically of the Fifth Dynasty, also appeared in the themes and style of this artistic decoration. For example, scenes where various Egyptian gods and goddesses solemnly grant the king symbols of power and longevity, or symbolically lead lines of captive foreigners to him, or even touching scenes where goddesses nurse the young king with their divine breast, emphasizing his special closeness to the world of the gods. The refined artistic taste of the ruling class of that era found its vivid reflection also in the very careful and harmonious selection of various contrasting stones in color and texture, used for finishing the temple interiors. For example, the floor and base of the walls of Sahure's Valley Temple, as well as its elegant columns with palm leaf capitals, were made of beautiful red Aswan granite. For the floor of some other rooms, shiny black basalt was used. And the temple walls themselves were built of dazzlingly white Tura limestone. The ceiling of the temple halls, to give it a symbolic resemblance to the night sky, was often painted a deep dark blue and decorated with countless relief golden stars. The long covered causeway leading from the Valley Temple up the plateau to the Mortuary Temple was also entirely decorated along its considerable length with magnificent reliefs depicting triumphal processions of the king, hunting scenes, fishing, agricultural work, and offering of gifts. The walls of the Mortuary Temple itself, located directly on the eastern side of the royal pyramid, were also richly decorated with scenes from the king's life, his victories, and rituals. This entire huge and harmoniously planned funerary complex of Sahure, like those of his successors, was undoubtedly intended to produce a deep and indelible impression on all its visitors, instilling in them the idea of the pharaoh's unshakable power and divinity. The royal mortuary temple during the 5th dynasty was not just some internal closed sanctuary of the entire funerary ensemble, accessible only to a narrow circle of priests. It housed the main cult statue of the deceased and deified king, which was the object of daily worship and sacrifices both during his lifetime in the Valley Temple and, especially importantly, was intended to remain so for all eternity after his death. Needless to say, all Egyptian rulers without exception who built such lavish tombs, of course, cherished precisely such a hope for an eternal mortuary cult. But in reality, only very few of these cults lasted longer than a few generations after the Asikisi, death of their founders, and then gradually fell into decline and oblivion. An invaluable and unique source of the most detailed information about the organization and daily performance of this royal mortuary cult during the Old Kingdom are the famous archives of temple papyrus documents miraculously preserved in the ruins of mortuary temples near the pyramids of Kings Neferuka and Neferefre at Abusir. This so-called Abusir archive, containing thousands of fragments of business and accounting documents, opens up for us an amazing and complex world of daily life and meticulous bureaucratic routine of an ancient Egyptian temple economy, in which strict and pedantic observance of all established formalities and rules was not just a service duty, but an integral part of the very world view and religious obligation. The staff of King Neferuka's mortuary temple, for example, as these documents show, was divided into several shifts, or philes, which served the temple in turn, changing every month. When undertaking their sacred duties at the beginning of each new month, the priests and employees of the new shift had to inspect the entire temple and its property most carefully. They attentively checked for any visible defects and damage to the temple building itself and its decoration, and then, according to very detailed and thorough inventory lists, they compared the actual presence of all temple property, which was strictly systematized by material, form, size, and storage location. Thus, for example, in one such miraculously preserved papyrus scroll, a most detailed list of all stone and flint items stored in the temple is provided. In the section Transparent Stone, Alabaster, in the chapter Cups, in the category White Cups, the inspecting priest made the following characteristic note about the condition of one of the vessels. Edge, base, and body of the vessel, repaired many times. Another item, a flint ritual blade, is described as follows. Small inlays of colored stone on the handle lost. In a very deplorable state, judging by the inventory, was also a precious silver table for ritual offerings. Wide crack found on the tabletop, legs very wobbly, surface covered with dark spots of oxidation. And all this, let us note, happened and was recorded only about 50 years after the death of King Neferuka himself, which quite eloquently tells us about the rapid deterioration and wear of even the most expensive temple property, despite all efforts to preserve it. Apparently, for ancient Egyptian temple administrators, it was much more important to formally check and record the very presence or absence of inventory according to the list than to actually monitor its physical preservation and timely repair. This pedantic formalism, carried to absurdity, was apparently a very characteristic phenomenon for any ancient society with a highly developed and ramified bureaucratic system of administration. With the same incredible scrupulousness and pedantry, all daily deliveries of food and other supplies necessary for maintaining the king's mortuary cult and feeding the priests were recorded in temple documents. But here, too, as the same papyri show, despite the strictest accounting, errors, short deliveries, or even theft often occurred, which even the most thorough and detailed inventory lists could not hide. Thus, for example, for the needs of King Neferukare's mortuary temple, 14 standard batches of special ritual bread were designated daily, which were supposed to arrive regularly from the royal bakeries. However, one day, as the report shows, the deliveries of this bread were completely absent for 4 consecutive days, and only on the 5th day did 70 batches of bread unexpectedly arrive at the temple at once, that is, the entire shortfall for the previous days. But then, for the next 6 days, there were no bread deliveries at all. And judging by the absence of any further investigation, this large shortfall was apparently simply written off by the temple administration for some reason. However, for the following 11 days, as the scribe notes with satisfaction, the necessary provisions were again supplied to the temple on time and in full. As can be seen from these unique documents, even in such an apparently highly organized and strictly controlled society as ancient Egypt of the Pyramid Age, it was by no means always possible to ensure an absolutely uninterrupted and ideal supply, even for such an important state institution as the Royal Mortuary Temple. This unexpected discovery, made thanks to the Abusir papyri, somewhat changes our previous, often idealized perception of ancient Egypt as a super-wise and absolutely rational civilization with a perfectly tuned system of administration. It is quite obvious that the real state apparatus of the Old Kingdom, unlike the almost perfect and eternal stone monuments it created, by no means always distinguished itself with such impeccable stability and efficiency, even in times of relative peace and material abundance, let alone during periods of serious political, economic, or climatic upheavals. If the very creators of this high-flown official ideology of the eternal and unshakable order of Maat had dared to face the truth impartially, they might have noticed that the dangerous seeds of future decline and disintegration of their seemingly so strong state had not only already been sown by the system itself, but had already begun to sprout their first, still not very noticeable, but alarming shoots. However, Pharaoh Unas, who is considered the last ruler of the 5th dynasty and reigned approximately from 2350 to 2325 BCE, seems to have been little concerned by all these growing problems and hidden contradictions. He was, apparently, too busy with other more important matters from his point of view, such as the revival of some ancient religious traditions and the further enrichment and complication of the already extremely complex official royal funerary ideology with ever new elements designed to ensure his personal immortality. He built his own last royal pyramid of the 5th dynasty, not in Abusir, like his immediate predecessors, but returned again to the ancient and prestigious necropolis of Saqqara, placing it in close proximity to the famous funerary complex of the Ede, great King Djoser. However, it is not so much this symbolic location that is the main distinguishing feature of Unas's pyramid. The most curious, most important, and most revolutionary innovation he saved for the interior decoration of the burial chambers, located deep beneath his small and rather modest tomb. He completely abandoned the previous, relatively primitive and mute decoration of the internal walls of royal burial chambers, characteristic of the pyramids of his predecessors from the 4th and early 5th dynasties, which either had no decoration at all or were cased with simple granite. Instead, Unas approached the internal design of his tomb much more thoughtfully and ideologically richly. The black color of his basalt sarcophagus, installed in the burial chamber, symbolized the fertile land of Egypt and rebirth, and the dark blue ceiling of the chamber, strewn with relief golden stars, depicted the night sky through which the king's soul was to travel. The surrounding walls of the burial chamber were carefully plastered with white gypsum and covered with elegant paintings depicting the facade of an ancient sanctuary, built of wooden posts with a roof of woven reed mats. The ancient Egyptians believed that this is how the very first archaic sanctuaries of their gods looked in the times of the primordial creation of the world. Thus, Unis's entire funerary ensemble was conceived as a kind of symbolic micromodel of the entire universe, at the center of which was the deceased and reborn king himself. But the most remarkable and truly revolutionary innovation in the decoration of the burial chamber of Unis's pyramid was the appearance on its walls of long vertical columns of hieroglyphs, completely covering the entire surface of the walls of the burial and antechamber. These hieroglyphic signs were carefully carved in stone and then painted with bright blue paint, which perhaps symbolized the life-giving waters of the primordial ocean Nun or the celestial azure of the afterlife. These are the so-called pyramid texts, the oldest known large collection of Egyptian religious and magical texts, and at the same time the only truly extensive literary monument preserved from the Old Kingdom era. The pyramid texts represent a huge and unsystematized collection of several hundred different prayers, spells, hymns, ritual formulas, and mythological fragments, the main purpose of which was to magically ensure and direct the soul of the deceased pharaoh after his death to the safe and blissful cosmic realm of the afterlife. There, it was to reunite with the incorruptible circumpolar stars, become one of the companions of the sun god Ra in his eternal journey across the sky, or be reborn in the image of the god Osiris, lord of the Duat. Analysis of the imagery, language, and content of some of these texts unequivocally indicates their extreme antiquity, and it is not excluded that some of them indeed date back to the most prehistoric times and reflect the oldest strata of Egyptian beliefs. Other fragments, it seems, were composed or edited already in the historical period, perhaps at the end of the first or during the second dynasty, and then transmitted orally or in the form of separate records on papyrus, until they were finally canonized and recorded on the walls of Unis's pyramid. These magical spells and ritual prayers undoubtedly always played a crucial role in performing the king's funeral rites and in the subsequent performance of his mortuary cult. However, the very idea of fixing, immortalizing them in stone on the walls of the royal tomb itself so that they would eternally act magically and help the king apparently belongs precisely to Pharaoh Unas or his wise priest theologians. The pyramid texts in Unis's tomb were not just ordinary decorative ornamentation of the free wall surface. On the contrary, their placement was carefully thought out, and the very purpose of these deliberately placed hieroglyphic texts on the walls was to magically enhance and activate the so-called symbolic geography of the pyramid itself and its internal chambers, turning it into a working model of the cosmos. Texts directly related to the afterlife duat itself and to the king's resurrection in the image of Osiris were concentrated mainly in the burial chamber itself, where the sarcophagus was located. And the chamber located in front of it, the antechamber, played the role of a kind of symbolic horizon, a place of rebirth and ascent, from which the reborn king could freely ascend to the eastern heavens to the god Ra. Thus, the sacred hieroglyphs, the architecture of the tomb, and its orientation to the cardinal points were intended to perfectly complement each other, repeatedly amplifying the magical energy that was designed to help Pharaoh Unas successfully overcome all the dangers of the afterlife and achieve eternal resurrection and bliss among the gods. But it was not just about complex funerary magic and rituals. The deceased king could firmly count on his brilliant rebirth and eternal life also because in life he was an absolute ruler, to whom not only all mere mortals obeyed unconditionally, but also, however strange it may seem to us, even the eternal gods of the Egyptian pantheon themselves. And since the gods themselves were forced to support and serve the king, consequently, all divine power and all cosmic truth were Isna Chalno on his side. Such an absolutely astounding and even somewhat sacrilegious assumption from our point of view about the complete superiority of the pharaoh over the gods found its most vivid and frank reflection in one of the most famous and shocking fragments of the pyramid texts inscribed on the walls of Unis's tomb. This is the so-called cannibal hymn, whose vivid, naturalistic, and frankly cruel imagery has earned it a very bad reputation among researchers and still causes numerous disputes. The short fragment from this hymn quoted below conveys its terrifying and primitive flavor quite well. This is Unas, he who eats men, he who feeds on gods. This is Unas, he who devours their magic, he who swallows their souls, Ka and Ba. Their great gods are for his morning meal, their medium gods are for his midday meal, their small gods are for his night meal. Their old men and their old women are for his burnt offering, i.e., for fuel. The court theologians of King Unas and the anonymous creators of these funerary hymns, it seems, surpass themselves in their desire to exalt the pharaoh, daring to so boldly and openly declare that Unus's divine power and eternal life in the afterlife grow and are maintained because he literally hunts the gods themselves, kills them, boils them in a cauldron, and then devours their essence, their magical power, and their souls. And no one and nothing in the entire universe could prevent him from thus achieving absolute cosmic immortality and power. Such an openly despotic and even terrifying stance towards the gods themselves, expressed in the cannibal hymn, of course, did not bode well for the real relations between this king and his mere mortal subjects either. Unus's own reign, the last pharaoh of the 5th dynasty, as far as we can judge from surviving sources, didn't leave any particularly noticeable or glorious mark on the political or economic history of Egypt, except for one standard scene on a relief from his mortuary temple, where the king is traditionally depicted fighting Asiatic Bedouin nomads. However, another group of unique and very realistic relief scenes covering the walls of the long covered causeway leading from Unus's valley temple to his pyramid at Saqqara deserves our special attention. They contain completely unexpected and truly horrifying episodes depicting extreme poverty, hunger, and the suffering of numerous human victims of some disaster. The modern public, unfortunately, is well acquainted with the horrors of mass famine from numerous television programs and photographs showing the unbearable suffering and calamities of the inhabitants of some regions of Africa and other parts of the world. Strikingly, these very vivid and naturalistic scenes, carved on the walls of Unus's mortuary complex more than 4,000 years ago, produce the same strong and shocking emotional impression today. Here, an extremely emaciated, almost skeletal woman supports with her last strength her husband dying of hunger, whose withered hand is weakly clutched by his friend or relative. And here another woman, completely crazed by hunger and despair, sits on the ground and convulsively bites lice from her own tangled hair. Next to her, a small boy with the characteristic swollen belly of starvation and sunken eyes pitifully begs some woman for a little food, which she probably does not have either. All these unbearable mental and physical sufferings of people dying of hunger are shown by the ancient Egyptian artist with astonishing plausibility and without any embellishment. However, there are no explanatory inscriptions for these terrible scenes, and therefore we cannot say anything completely definite about who these unfortunate starving people were and when and where these tragic events took place. It seems very unlikely that they were the Egyptians themselves, inhabitants of the fertile Nile Valley, as depicting one's own people in such a deplorable state would contradict the entire official ideology of the pharaohs. It should not be forgotten that the primary task of any tomb painting or relief, especially in the funerary complexes of the kings themselves, was to create and eternally perpetuate an ideal, harmonious, and prosperous picture of the world. Therefore, it seems much more logical and probable to conclude that these unfortunate and emaciated by hunger people are none other than nomadic Bedouin tribes, perhaps those very sand-dwellers who were eternal neighbors and often enemies of Egypt. They were descendants of those ancient pastoral tribes who once inhabited Egypt itself in prehistoric times, but were then driven out into the desert. Now they were forced to wage a constant and desperate struggle for survival in extremely arid and barren lands surrounding the fertile and rich Nile Valley from the east and west. Depictions of their suffering from hunger in the royal funerary complex were apparently intended to create a sharp and instructive contrasting background for demonstrating the eternal abundance, order, and prosperous life of the Egyptians themselves, under the wise rule of their divine pharaoh. The extreme squalor and instability of the existence of these wild nomadic tribes, not subject to Unus's beneficent rule, served simultaneously as an unpleasant reminder of the constant threat of chaos emanating from outside, and as a kind of dire warning to his own subjects about what awaited them if they dared to violate the order he had established. Despite all the ostentatious piety and refined solar theology of the Fifth Dynasty rulers, the old model of despotic power based on force and fear seems to have never been completely overcome or forgotten in ancient Egypt. However, all this enormous power of official art and state architecture, all these complex and sophisticated magical spells and mortuary prayers, designed to ensure the king eternal immortality and power, turned out, by a twist of fate, to be completely insufficient to grant the aging king Unus a simple son and heir. By a bitter irony of fate, this reformer king, who first decorated his pyramid with sacred texts, was destined to die without leaving a direct male heir. Therefore, after his death, the throne of Egypt passed to a man, apparently of completely obscure origin, named Teti, who perhaps was married to Unus's daughter Iput, and thanks to this marriage was able to claim the throne. To somehow ensure the appearance of legitimate succession of power from the old, 5th dynasty to the new, 6th, of which he himself became the founder, Teti, without wasting time, hastened to marry his predecessor, Unus's daughter, Princess Iput. Thus, in a rather tense atmosphere of political uncertainty, hidden court intrigues, and barely contained internal contradictions, the entire long reign of the 6th and last dynasty of the Old Kingdom began and passed, ruling approximately from 2325 to 2175 BCE. Lacking sufficiently strong and indisputable hereditary rights to the royal throne, the new pharaoh Teti had to actively seek the support and loyalty of the most influential and powerful nobles of his time from the very beginning of his reign. The ostentatiously lavish and huge mastaba tombs of these, his closest supporters and favorites, now crowd around King Teti's own relatively small and modest pyramid at Saqqara, clearly indicating that the new monarch's personal favor and benevolence had once again become an absolutely necessary condition for successful career advancement and enrichment at court. His loyal vizier Kagemni, who was practically his right hand and managed all state affairs, enjoyed almost unlimited influence and power under Teti. No less, if not greater, influence and wealth under Teti was also enjoyed by another of his famous viziers, Mereruka, whose huge and luxurious tomb at Saqqara, consisting of 32 richly decorated rooms, still astounds the imagination. The wealth and outrageous luxury that surrounded this Mereruka in life, depicted in detail on the walls of his tomb, probably surpassed the wildest dreams of his contemporaries. He clearly indulged his exquisite taste with the rarest and most expensive delicacies. The numerous scenes from the life of his estates depicted in his tomb show us very curious examples of animal husbandry that was by no means traditional or very common in Egypt. Here we see his servants fattening not only ordinary domestic livestock for the vizier's table, but also semi-wild desert antelopes, which they kept in special enclosures and fed from mangers. It also depicts them force-feeding wild cranes and geese, stuffing food into their beaks. Apparently, the famous French dish foie gras was invented long before the French, already in ancient Egypt. What is most surprising and even somewhat repulsive to us is that on Mereruka's estates, it seems, even ferocious hyenas were fattened for slaughter for food. So generously and ingeniously did King Teti lavish gifts upon his closest and most trusted advisers for their loyal service and loyalty, naively hoping that they would always remain his most reliable and devoted supporters. However, as often happens in history, it was not so much the machinations of distant or offended officials that posed the main and immediate threat to the monarch's own life and crown, as the secret intrigues and conspiracies of his own rebellious relatives, especially his numerous sons, born of secondary wives and concubines and lacking legitimate rights to the throne. For them, an attempt to seize supreme power by force, through a palace coup or the assassination of the ruling pharaoh, was often the only, albeit extremely risky, alternative to a joyless life of idle inactivity and obscurity at court. If we are to believe Manetho's later testimony, it was precisely such a tragic fate that befell King Teti himself. He allegedly fell victim to a conspiracy and was killed by his own bodyguards. Although there is no direct contemporary confirmation of this, sources from that time do indeed show some ambiguity and a possible lacuna in the order of succession immediately after Teti's death. It is possible that for some, albeit very short, time after Teti's alleged assassination, the throne of Egypt was occupied by a certain usurper, a king named Userkaf, about whose reign we know practically nothing, except the very fact of his existence. It is not surprising that Teti's legitimate son and heir, Pharaoh Pepi I, upon coming to power after these troubled and possibly bloody events, was very cautious and suspicious in his actions throughout his long reign. Only a very narrow and carefully vetted circle of the country's most influential and loyal nobles enjoyed his boundless trust. This circle, for example, included his own mother-in-law, whom he appointed to the unprecedentedly high post for a woman of vizier of Upper Egypt, and his son-in-law named Jau. In addition, Pepi I devoted considerable attention and enormous efforts to constantly maintaining and strengthening the prestige of his royal authority throughout the country, universally erecting numerous small temples and chapels dedicated to his own mortuary cult. Such structures have been discovered from the city of Bubastis in the central delta to Abydos and Gebtu, modern Kift, in Upper Egypt. It is curious to note that during this period, temples dedicated to local traditional gods were apparently practically unknown or very few in Egypt, as the main religious and construction energy of the entire society was still directed almost exclusively to the glorification and deification of the ruling pharaoh himself. But all these costly architectural contrivances and propagandistic efforts could only affect the common population, while against secret and powerful adversaries in the king's own immediate circle, they were, unfortunately, completely useless. An invaluable and unique source, brightly illuminating for us the complex and intrigue-filled life of the royal court during Pepi, the first's nearly 40-year reign, which is dated approximately from 2315 to 2d. 1275 BCE, is the famous and very detailed autobiography of another influential nobleman of that time, named Weni. This autobiography was carefully carved on the walls of his tomb at Abydos. From it, we learn that Weni began his long and brilliant career with the modest post of chief of the royal granary, but thanks to his devotion and abilities, he quickly rose to become a very influential financial official in the central palace administration. Pharaoh Pepi I clearly favored this diligent and, apparently, very capable nobleman, which contributed to his further rapid advancement in service. He soon became overseer of the royal robing room and even chief of the palace bodyguards, meaning he was one of the pharaoh's closest and most trusted advisers with access to his person. As a sign of his special and exceptional trust, the king once ordered Weni specifically to handle the most delicate and secret judicial cases concerning the royal harem itself. "I alone investigated this matter," Weni proudly reports. Alone with the sole chief dignitary and judge. "I acted on behalf of the king himself for his sacred women's house." The pharaoh's women's house, or royal harem, which included not only the household of his numerous female relatives, but also all his secondary wives and concubines, with their children and servants, was in ancient Egypt a special, very rich, and influential state institution, enjoying a considerable degree of economic and administrative independence. Extensive landholdings and entire craft workshops, especially weaving, were allocated for the needs of the women's house, and therefore it often represented a potential and very serious threat to the king's own sole power, as it was precisely within the women's house that various intrigues were constantly woven and dangerous conspiracies often born with the aim of overthrowing the ruling king and placing one of his sons by some influential queen on the throne. Therefore, the pharaoh desperately needed an absolutely loyal and devoted person who could discreetly observe everything happening in the women's house and timely inform him of all impending conspiracies. It was precisely such a person for King Pepi I that the nobleman Weni apparently became. Thanks to his diligence, vigilance, and devotion, one such dangerous conspiracy, which arose in the very heart of the royal harem, was timely uncovered and suppressed. To keep the very fact of this betrayal in strictest secrecy and prevent its wide publicity, which could undermine the king's authority, it was necessary to investigate this delicate matter very quickly, secretly, and without undue fuss, and to bring all culprits to the strictest accountability. Weni, as he himself reports, acted in this situation in the most appropriate manner. When a secret matter was being conducted in the king's own women's house against the great scepter, that is, against the chief queen, who was apparently involved in the conspiracy, His Majesty ordered me to conduct the entire interrogation completely alone. There was no other judge, no other high dignitary, nor any other court dignitaries. Only I alone. Never before in history had a man of my relatively low position heard such a secret and important matter of the king's own women's house. But His Majesty ordered me to investigate this matter precisely because in his heart he trusted me much more than any other of his dignitaries, more than any other of his nobles, more than any other of his servants. For this exceptionally loyal and dangerous service, Weni was worthily and generously rewarded by his king. Pepi I raised him to the highest rank of sole friend of the king and granted him as a special favor a precious stone sarcophagus for his tomb, a privilege that at that time was usually granted only to the closest members of the royal family itself. This huge and heavy monolithic sarcophagus, as Weni proudly reports, was delivered to him directly to the palace on a large royal ship, along with its lid, false door, offering table, 2 door jambs, and table for ritual feasts, by the royal seal-bearer himself, accompanied by an entire crew of royal sailors. This unheard-of sign of royal favor was undoubtedly a great honor for Weni, and a testament to his enormous influence at court. But in that world of the 6th dynasty of Egypt, full of dangers and uncertainties, death and threat awaited the almighty king not only within the walls of his own palace, at the hands of his own relatives or courtiers. At the very borders of Egypt, in the surrounding deserts, numerous warlike and often destitute nomadic tribes still lived. These were those same Bedouins whom Pharaoh Unas had so ruthlessly and caricaturedly depicted on the reliefs of his mortuary causeway, and they looked with ever-increasing greed and envy at the untold riches and fertile lands of the prosperous Nile Valley. These sand-dwellers, as the ancient Egyptians themselves somewhat disparagingly and contemptuously called them, from time to time united and rebelled against centuries-old Egyptian oppression and exploitation, raiding the border regions of the Iyaos country. One such major revolt of Asiatic nomads apparently provoked a swift, decisive, and very harsh military reaction from the Egyptian government under Pepi I. The punitive expedition against these rebellious sand-dwellers was led by the same loyal and highly experienced nobleman Weni. With amazing ease, exchanging the cool and luxurious chambers of the royal palace for the dusty and dangerous battlefield, he boldly led a large Egyptian army, consisting of both Egyptian detachments and numerous detachments of Nubian mercenaries, from the southern lands through the eastern delta and the Sinai Desert. His goal was to inflict a crushing defeat on the rebellious Bedouins in their own native sands of southern Palestine. One part of the Egyptian army, as Weni reports, proceeded by land, while another, larger part, was secretly transported by sea on transport ships and unexpectedly landed deep in the rear of the unsuspecting enemy, effectively snapping shut the deadly jaws of a well-planned military trap. Thanks to this cunning and innovative tactic of a double strike, the Egyptians achieved a complete and crushing victory, although the Bedouins themselves, fighting for their freedom and land, offered them very fierce and desperate resistance. Weni reported with unconcealed pride in his autobiography that His Majesty sent me as many as 5 times to lead this victorious army and completely pacify the rebellious land of the sand dwellers whenever they rebelled against him again. At this same time, under Pepi I and his successors, the rulers of Egypt once again began to show increased interest in the lands lying south of the first Nile cataract, that is, Nubia. This is confirmed not only by the frequent mention of Nubian mercenaries in the Egyptian army, but also by other data. However, this time the Egyptians were interested not only in the traditional natural and human wealth of Nubia itself, which they had exploited before. New, previously unknown or insignificant forces had come into motion on the uppermost southern borders of the Nile Valley, threatening to disrupt or intercept Egypt's traditional and vital trade links with the distant regions of Central Africa, lying south of the Sahara. Aware of this new potential threat to their economic interests, the Egyptian government took a number of appropriate preventive measures. In particular, a permanent Egyptian military fortress and administrative center was founded or significantly strengthened in the strategically important Dakhla Oasis, which was located at the intersection of ancient caravan routes leading from Egypt to both Nubia and Libya. The main town of this oasis, Ain Asil, was surrounded by powerful fortress walls and turned into a real Egyptian military base, where a significant garrison was permanently stationed, headed by a specially appointed official with the title Commander of the Oasis. An important component of this newly established southern military infrastructure was also a whole network of small observation and guard posts, which were placed on high hills and rocks along the main caravan routes leading to the Waitaisho oasis from the Nile Valley. These posts were located at such a distance from each other as to be within direct line of sight and were supplied with everything necessary directly from the Nile Valley. Thanks to this system of fortresses and observation posts, the Egyptians could now quite effectively control any large movements of people and goods in both directions along all key caravan routes in this region, thereby not only protecting their own trade interests but also deterring the possible penetration into Egypt of hostile Nubian or Libyan tribes. Under Pharaoh Mereruka, son and heir of Pepi I, the tireless and devoted nobleman Weni reached the pinnacle of his career. He was appointed governor of all Upper Egypt, that is, the southern part of the country. He became the first known commoner not belonging to the royal family to occupy such an exceptionally high and responsible post. The loyal nobleman was now charged not only with governing a vast territory, but also with closely monitoring everything happening on the restless southern border of the country and immediately reporting everything to his master in Memphis. When the chiefs of several Nubian tribes arrived in Egypt from the south to express their submission and bring tribute, the young pharaoh Mereruka himself personally came to the southern border, to the first cataract, to meet them and accept their oath. This unprecedented act for that time on the part of an Egyptian pharaoh speaks for itself. The king wanted either to achieve complete and unconditional loyalty from his restless southern neighbors, or at least to deter them from any hostile actions against Egypt. But a single visit by the king himself to the border and the reports sent by local Egyptian authorities via messengers to the capital were obviously completely insufficient to ensure long-term security and stability on the southern frontiers of the Odd state. Therefore, a third important aspect of Egyptian foreign policy in Nubia at this time was the active collection of intelligence information directly in Nubia itself, for which special trade and diplomatic expeditions were organized. The ancient Egyptian border town of Abu on the island of Elephantine had always been a kind of gateway of Egypt to Nubia. Its inhabitants, many of whom were traders or border guards, knew these southern lands and their inhabitants much better than any of their compatriots, and many of them were connected by close trade, and sometimes even family ties with the Pos, population living on the other side of the southern border. Already under King Teti, Pepi I's predecessor, the Egyptian authorities apparently began to organize the first, still sporadic, trade and reconnaissance expeditions deep into Nubia. In the changed and more tense circumstances of Mereruka's time, these important missions required a much more regular and systematic character. Among the numerous inhabitants of the border town of Abu, only an official bearing the special title Chief of Scouts or Chief of Interpreters could successfully cope with such a complex and dangerous task. In addition to ensuring the security of the southern borders and collecting information, he was also responsible for the regular supply to the king's treasury of various rare and valuable foreign goods from Nubia and Central Africa. By personal order of Pharaoh Mereruka, such a chief of scouts named Harkhuf and his father Iri embarked on an extremely distant and unusual journey. Their ultimate goal was the distant and almost unknown to the Egyptians land of Yam, located somewhere in the upper reaches of the Nile, possibly in the region of modern Sudan or even Ethiopia, to which direct Egyptian influence had not yet extended. At the end of this incredibly long and dangerous journey, which was more than 1,000 miles one way and took a full 7 months, father and son not only managed to return safely to Egypt, but also brought for their master many wonderful and rare gifts from the land of Yam. However, apparently, the greatest value for the Egyptian government was not so much these exotic goods themselves as the important information collected by Harkhuf about the political situation and internal affairs of Nubia itself. And this information was apparently so alarming that Pharaoh Mereruka immediately ordered Harkhuf to set out again for the land of Yam with a new, even more responsible mission. This time, casting aside the mask of a peaceful merchant, the fearless Egyptian nobleman, as he himself reports in his tomb inscription, reveals the true intelligence-gathering purposes of his second 8-month journey. I returned through the lands of the ruler of the regions of Setju and Irachet, and thus discovered these previously unknown foreign countries. The news that Harkhuf brought to his master from Nubia this time was apparently even more disheartening, as it clearly testified to the serious political changes taking place there, namely the unification of previously scattered Nubian tribes and chiefdoms into larger and stronger political entities. The unification of the regions of Setju and Irachet under one ruler was a very alarming sign for Egypt, which could not be ignored. Considering these new and dangerous circumstances, during his third journey to the distant land of Yam, Harkhuf, showing prudence and caution, decided to go there not by the usual route through the Nile Valley, but by a detour through a chain of western oases along the so-called Oasis Road. However, in the land of Yam itself, new unpleasant news awaited him. The local king at that time was just setting out on a major military campaign against the hostile Temahu tribes, who lived somewhere in the southeastern part of the Libyan desert. Of the former relative stability in the region, not a trace remained. All of northeast Africa, it seems, had come into motion. Without hesitating for a moment, the brave Egyptian envoy Harkhuf immediately set off after the ruler of the Yamites directly into the land of the Temahu, where their important meeting took place. Having apparently reached some new trade or political agreements with the Yamites, Harkhuf soon arrived safely back in Egypt, as he himself proudly reports, with 300 heavily laden donkeys, carrying incense, black ebony wood, frankincense, hekenu perfumed oil, leopard skins, elephant tusks, and many other beautiful gifts. However, on the way back, already in Lower Nubia itself, the Egyptian caravan encountered a new serious threat from the now unified and strengthened king of the Chi, regions of Setju and Irachet, who by that time had managed to add to his growing domains also the important region of Wawat, located directly north of the Second Nile Cataract. Feeling his increased strength, this new Nubian king obviously was not going to simply allow the Egyptian envoy Harkhuf to pass unhindered through his lands with such a huge and rich caravan. And only the presence of an impressive armed escort with Harkhuf, provided to him by the king of the Yamits, deterred this Nubian ruler from an open attack. Unexpectedly for themselves, the mighty Egyptians, accustomed to their complete dominance in the region, ceased to be the only truly strong and influential power in the Upper Nile Valley. Centuries-old Egyptian hegemony in Nubia was now really threatened by these new, rapidly strengthened and unified rulers of Nubia. This was a strong and painful blow to the prestige and interests of the most prosperous and powerful people of the entire ancient world. Only the most decisive and immediate actions on the part of the Central Egyptian authorities could restore the former state of affairs and the former greatness of Egypt in this region. But shortly after Harkhuf's triumphant return from his third Nubian journey, Pharaoh Mereruka suddenly died, leaving on the throne only a 6-year-old son, Pepi II. The young Pepi II Neferkare was, of course, too young to independently and effectively rule a huge country in such a complex and dangerous period for it. Real power in the country in the early years of his reign was in the hands of a regency council, headed apparently by his mother, Queen Ankhesen Pepi, and her brother, the powerful nobleman Jau. These new, perhaps not very far-sighted rulers of Egypt decided, at least outwardly, to maintain the appearance of continuity in foreign policy towards Nubia, and for the last time sent the already elderly but still loyal and experienced nobleman, Harkhuf, on his fourth journey to the distant land of Yam. However, this time, his main task was not so much secret observation of the Nubians or concluding alliances as simply obtaining some rare and exotic gifts for the entertainment of the new young ruler of Egypt. These unusual gifts were probably intended to serve as tangible proof for the common people and courtiers that mighty Egypt still ruled supreme over all neighboring lands, although of this real power by that time, perhaps, only an appearance remained. It was a kind of Belshazzar's feast in the Egyptian manner, an attempt to hide the growing crisis behind a facade of former greatness. The faithful Harkhuf, this time too, managed to find a suitable and very unusual gift, which was sure to please the 6-year-old royal boy. It was, as Harkhuf himself reports, a dwarf for the dances of the god from the land at the very edge of the horizon. When the long-awaited news that Harkhuf was bringing this amazing dancing dwarf from the very edge of the world finally reached the ears of the little King Pepi II, he apparently was overcome with indescribable delight, and, consumed by childish impatience, immediately wrote an excited and very touching personal letter to Harkhuf himself, ordering him to return to the royal palace as soon as possible with this living exotic toy. "Turn without delay to the north, to my palace," wrote the young pharaoh, "and be sure to bring with you this dwarf, who will delight and please the heart of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt Neferkare. May he live forever. If he goes down with you into your boat, then be sure to appoint the best and most reliable men, who will constantly surround him and guard him on both sides of the boat, and under no circumstances let him accidentally fall into the water. If he sleeps at night, then also be sure to appoint the best and most vigilant men who will sleep with him in his tent, and check on him 10 times every night. For my majesty desires to see this dwarf much more than all the gifts of Sinai and all the treasures of Punt." To receive such a personal letter from the king himself, even from a very small boy, was undoubtedly a great and rare honor for any Egyptian official. To preserve for all time this unique sign of the highest sovereign favor, the elderly nobleman, Harkhuf, ordered the full text of this royal letter to be carved on one of the walls of his own tomb at Aswan, in the most honorable place, next to a detailed report of his 4 dangerous journeys to Nubia. This letter was immortalized by him as the main evidence of his loyal service and the pharaoh's special favor. Unfortunately, this somewhat naive and boyish enthusiasm of young Pepi II, so vividly manifested in his letter to Harkhuf, could in no way solve either the serious internal problems that were increasingly brewing in Egypt itself, or the external threats that were being felt more and more strongly on its borders. The union of southern Nubian states, the very fact of whose appearance was first recorded by the perceptive Harkhuf during Mereruka's reign, continued to rapidly gain strength and became a source of increasingly serious and constant problems for Egyptian domination in the region. During one of the subsequent military campaigns in Nubia, undertaken already under Pepi II, the supreme vizier of Egypt himself, named Mehu, tragically died, and his son, with great difficulty and risk to his life, managed to return his father's body to his homeland for a proper burial. Although the Egyptians apparently still firmly held the important strategic Dakhla oasis in the Libyan desert, Nubia itself by this time was effectively no longer subordinate to them. The internal political situation in Egypt itself was also deteriorating. The policy of delegating a significant part of power to the localities, to the provinces, which had been initiated under the last pharaohs of the 5th dynasty, ultimately proved to be a very rash decision which had irreversible and extremely negative consequences for the unity and stability of the state. Local rulers, nomarchs, feeling the weakening of central authority, especially in the conditions of the long reign of an initially underage Pepi II, increasingly strengthened their independence. They had long since called themselves great lords of their province's nomes, gradually concentrating more and more real power and resources in their hands, shamelessly appropriating both the highest civil and important local religious positions. As tangible proof of the inability of the central government in Memphis to effectively curb this dangerous strengthening of the nomarchs' power and ambitions, one can cite the impressive list of numerous positions and lavish titles of a certain Pepi I, who was a powerful governor in the town of Mer in Middle Egypt at the end of Pepi II's reign. He proudly styled himself hereditary prince, nobleman, high dignitary, secret counselor, shepherd of Nechan, chief of Nekheb, chief justice, and Jati, i.e., vizier, although he was not one, chief keeper of the royal tablet, bearer of the royal seal, pillar of the sacred Apis bull, herald of the palace of Pi, chief of both great granaries, overseer of both sacred baths, chief of every storehouse, chief administrator of all affairs, keeper of the royal tablet of the inner court, bearer of the divine seal, sole friend of the king, he who reads the sacred texts, head of all Upper Egypt in its Middle Seps districts, treasurer of the god, support for the common people, pillar of the Kenmut district, priest of the goddess Mat, initiate into all secrets of the sovereign's command, and of course enjoying the unwavering favor of the king in everything. Obviously, such all-powerful local officials were now much more concerned with their own personal well-being, wealth, and power in their nome than with the distant and weakening fate of the entire Egyptian state and its aging pharaoh. The traditional patronage and favor of the king, it seems, were gradually losing all real meaning for them. Outwardly, Pepi II's own pyramid, built by him at Saqqara, didn't differ significantly in any way from the tombs of his 6th dynasty predecessors, and its internal chambers were also entirely covered with traditional pyramid texts. But in the architecture and artistic decoration of his mortuary pyramid temple, signs of decline and creative exhaustion are already clearly visible. His craftsmen almost blindly and not very skillfully imitated the models of King Sahure's magnificent funerary complex from the 5th dynasty at Abusir, built almost 2 centuries earlier. Like everything in this troubled time of the Old Kingdom's decline, the country's cultural life also apparently was experiencing a certain decline and stagnation, and the only way out for official art was the increasingly frequent and mechanical recourse to idealized models of the glorious golden age of the past. To these growing political and cultural troubles at the end of Pepi II's reign were added, apparently, also serious economic problems, caused, as some researchers believe, by prolonged periods of abnormally low Nile floods. These weak floods, if they indeed took place, must have dealt a severe and lasting blow to all of Egypt's agriculture, leading to crop failures, famine, and social unrest. Indirect confirmation of this may be the complete cessation of work and desolation of the famous basalt quarries in the Fayum oasis, which were the main and almost only source of this valuable hardstone throughout the Old Kingdom. Perhaps this happened due to the severe drying up of Lake Birket Karun, ancient Lake Moeris, and the Bahar Yusuf Canal that fed it, as a result of which the lake shores became too far from the stone quarrying site, making its transportation by water impossible or unprofitable. Poor harvests and the general decline of the irrigation system undoubtedly provoked a deep economic crisis of a national scale. In former, more prosperous times, a strong and effective central government could probably have somehow mitigated the consequences of such a crisis by timely opening its huge state granaries and organizing a fair distribution of accumulated food reserves among the starving population. However, the elderly and, perhaps already infirm, Pharaoh Pepi II, who by then had been ruling for almost a whole century, was apparently completely unable to adequately respond to these new challenges and solve the accumulated problems. His memory in much later popular tradition, if we are to believe some hints in Manetho and Herodotus, was preserved in the form of some obscene and scandalous anecdotes, painting a very unattractive image of this last great pharaoh of the Old Kingdom, as an extremely weak, inept, effete, and even effeminate ruler who completely neglected important state affairs and allegedly paid unhealthy and excessive attention to one of his young and handsome generals. However, the main and real source of all the problems at the end of his reign was, of course, not the pharaoh's alleged sexual preferences, but his astonishing and almost supernatural longevity. Usually, a long and stable reign of a monarch was considered in ancient Egypt the greatest good and a guarantee of prosperity and stability for the entire dynasty. But this incredibly long reign of Pepi II, who, according to Manetho, was on the throne for a full 94 years, from 2260 to 2175 BCE, although modern historians tend to shorten this period somewhat, ultimately created many acute problems, primarily related to succession. The long-lived king outlived not only at least 10 of his supreme viziers, but also, much more importantly, almost all of his numerous sons and potential heirs. As a result, his elderly and weakened family had to make considerable, desperate efforts after his death to find at least one single candidate for the vacant throne who enjoyed at least some general support and recognition. However, the process of political decay and disintegration of the country by this time had already gone too far, and it was practically impossible to stop it. The young and energetic monarch who ascended the throne as a child had by the end of his reign turned into a decrepit, exhausted, and perhaps no longer fully adequate old man. The theoretically immortal and divine king, and to his desperate subjects he probably increasingly seemed so, had remained in power for far too long, outliving all his contemporaries and becoming a living anachronism. When, finally, his inevitable hour of death did come, this long-awaited event marked the end not only of his incredibly long earthly life, but also the end of an entire great era in the history of Egypt. Thus, in chaos, decline, and uncertainty, the glorious and mighty Old Kingdom came to an end.